Hello there. If you're new here, thanks for stopping by. Every Friday we sit down and chat about a case that we feel has an important message that can help others in similar situations, save a life, change mindsets, or even contribute in changing laws. But before we dive in, here's a little side note. Every bit of information, images or footage was compiled from what's available online, or if we were lucky in some cases, from the very people closest to the case. All opinions expressed are our own. We mean absolutely no disrespect. So don't click out and stay a while.
In a world of injustice and chaos, the need for coherence has never been greater, and in the vastness of information, never has our thirst for truth and meaning been bigger. Dee McDonald lives on high alert today. Her stalker, Gardiner, got out of jail on Sunday, January 12, 2021. When Dee rang her local police to express her fear that he might come looking for her, she received the same piece of advice she'd been given 5 years prior at the very start of her stalking story. I was told that I should leave my home if I felt like I was in danger, that I needed to go to a woman's refuge. Dee had been worried that her stalker would pick right where he left off, or maybe worse this time. He might have been fuming over his arrest and time in jail. But this story didn't start with fear, threats, and a serious case of PTSD for Dee McDonald. This case is brought to you all the way from the land down under, also referred to by some as the Promised Land. As the sun goes down on Melbourne, the city comes to life. Although Melbourne is ranked as one of the top 10 safest cities in the world to live in, it has also witnessed the vicious stalking case of Dee McDonald. This is Dee's story, in her own words. I have had a stalker since 2015. This was a person I never lived with, never had children to, never married. I met him at work and we dated for a few months. He never stayed overnight in my home either. Yet, he became so controlling I couldn't do anything, so I told him I didn't want to see him anymore. This resulted in 5 years of hell. Dee only dated Gardiner for a few months, but splitting up would see her life change forever. It all began in 2014. Dee held a job as a supervisor at a Big W in Melbourne, a job in which she excelled and took pride in assisting all her customers. She wasn't easily fazed. Meeting Gardiner was a chance meeting that would change Dee's life drastically. That day was just like any other day. When she noticed a heavy-set man arguing with one of her staff, she immediately stepped in to help, and within minutes all was sorted and Gardiner left the store a happy customer. However, to Dee's surprise, he later returned and handed her a single rose and a note, which read, "You made my day. I would love to get to know you and have the pleasure of your company over dinner." At first, Dee thought nothing of it, just a happy and grateful customer who just wanted to thank her. But the note was passed around amongst her colleagues, and the staff encouraged her to give him a chance. She was quite hesitant, but she reluctantly agreed to a coffee, which soon became dinner, which led to a 5 months on-again, off-again relationship. She was drawn to the way he came across, a charming gentleman who was quite family-oriented. At 62, Gardiner had 3 children with 2 former partners. He once worked in the tech and motor industry. However, he eventually had to end his career due to an injury that caused him to limp slightly. And at this point in her life, Dee wasn't necessarily looking for love either. It had only been a year since her divorce, and she was enjoying her life as a single mum to her kids. She enjoyed live music and regularly frequented 2 wine bars in Melbourne's Bayside with her best friend Kathy Maney. Max worked his charms on Dee's sister Michelle when she came to Christmas Day lunch in 2014, who thought Max was a good catch. Michelle later recalls that she thought Max was quite attentive and nice, and she remembers particular moments during that first meeting. If Dee sat on the couch, he'd sit right next to her, holding her hand, or lay a hand on her knee. You didn't think much of it, and put it to the account that it's a new relationship. He probably just wanted to be with her all the time. But looking back now, he probably was displaying the early red flags of being possessive. The very next day, though, Dee broke up with Gardiner, feeling he was trying to control her and getting between her and her children. Max was even jealous of her son, and that was the trigger for Dee. He even got jealous when friends came to kiss her to wish her happy birthday on the night that Dee took him to one of her favorite wine places. When Max got very jealous of Dee's son, that was the trigger for her, where Dee said, "That's it. No one comes between me and my kids." At the time, Michelle, her sister, thought she'd been maybe a bit too harsh. Unexpectedly, also she thought, Max turned up at another bar she frequented, and after a little encouragement, Dee decided to give him another chance. Unfortunately, Gardiner only proved to be getting more possessive over Dee. She did not even have a bit of freedom left. If she needed to go anywhere, he'd be the one taking her. It came to a point where she couldn't do anything on her own anymore. Finally, Dee put a stop to this insufferable relationship in May 2015, and she thought that move would give her her freedom and her life back. But Dee had no idea what was in store for her thereafter. Max Gardiner started a smear campaign against her and her best friend. He attacked her parents' home, stalked her youngest daughter, and caused damages to her vehicle. Actually, he would attack any vehicle that Dee would dare to step in, and then he would try and play the court system to try and attack her further. When she'd go out to meet her friends, whenever she'd leave to return home, she'd find her car damaged. Her tires were slashed, side mirrors and wipers broken off, expansion foam sprayed all over her car, and stripped nails were found in her front tires. It was Dee's brother-in-law who ripped the nails out. He remembers that it was the strangest thing, as both nails were placed right across the tread. They couldn't have got in just by driving over. Dee finally texted Gardiner and asked him to leave her alone, and she took one step further and took out an intervention order against him to keep him at a safe distance. He responded that he only cared for her and that he would leave her alone. Finally, I can breathe. But it wasn't some weeks after that she went out with a friend to Melbourne's inner north, and when they returned to the car, they discovered a flat tire, and that was her friend's car. Her friend immediately told Dee, "I think it's Max." She ran into a nearby store to check CCTV footage, and the footage showed a man kneeling next to the front tire. They were quite sure that it was Max. But when police questioned him about the incident, he accused Dee of making up those allegations and added that he had never, ever threatened Dee, that she was the one being hurtful and disrespectful to him, that all she wanted was to cause grief. He even tried several times to put an intervention order on Dee, citing she was the one inciting violence against him and that she was a vindictive and angry person. The first time, in 2015, he said that Dee's ex-husband had told him that she was vindictive and has a bad temper. Max had told the court that Dee's youngest daughter had given him her father's phone number Dee's ex-husband, which was actually untrue. Her youngest daughter never even liked Max and never spoke to him. And her ex, she's still very good friends with, has actually never spoken to Max, neither him nor his family, and they're all very good friends. Finally, Dee received a 10-year intervention order against Max in 2016. But to retaliate, Max took her to court, seeking a 10-year order against Dee in 2017. He also went on to create a Facebook post stating that Dee had accused him of being in front of her house and that she wanted people to attack him. The truth is that she'd put up several posts in pages warning people that a guy was running around wearing a balaclava and had damaged her home. She asked people not to approach him but to call the police. What Max did was take the footage of the guy in the balaclava and put in a photo of himself. He took comments from other posts about home invasions and said they were in her post. But the magistrate sided with Max yet again and told her lawyer to take her outside and talk some sense into his client. Her lawyer kept arguing that the post did not exist, and the magistrate then replied that it was neither here nor there. Point to report every incident, but she was always told that there was just not enough proof. She'd even installed CCTV camera at her house, where you clearly see a man wearing a balaclava lurking around and creeping around Dee's house. This evidence was also not good enough. Even with the CCTV evidence, police still stated that his face was not clearly identifiable. Some of the police officers even felt that it was indeed Max in front of Dee's house. They could identify it by his walk, as Max limped a bit. But Dee's hope that this was going to be enough to charge Max were quashed when they told her flat out that they couldn't because he wore a balaclava and no magistrate would agree to convict him. Some of the advice she'd received was to get some neighbors to tackle him, rip the balaclava off, and take pictures for the police next time he comes around. Next, Max started a smear campaign when he started posting crude posters around the popular joints that Dee and Kathy frequented. CCTV caught him again, but he was disguised in a ski suit and balaclava. Max was once again brought in for questioning. But you see, nothing came of it. The stalking went on and on and on viciously, despite being taken in 3 times for breaching the intervention order Dee had against him. Most times she went out, something would happen. Always something different. There was no pattern to the attacks either. Dee would find herself making police reports all over Melbourne. She would have anxiety attacks each time she had to go out, and she could never really relax. When she did relax, then he would strike. So she was always on alert. It happened no matter if she drove or a friend did. There will always be attacks on their cars. Every single noise at home she'd be up and checking the cameras. She never slept, and it is the same to this day. Professor Heather Douglas, an expert on criminal justice and domestic violence, says non-physical forms of violence are harder to prove. People who are experiencing stalking are 2.5 times more likely to suffer serious physical harm and even death as a result of stalking. Eventually, both Dee and Kathy stopped going out altogether, as Max always seemed to be aware of their whereabouts, and it affected them both mentally. Kathy would lose it at times and beg Dee to make it go away, make it stop, Dee, something Dee was desperately hoping for as well. The situation got so intense that she started to lose her friends and fighting with family members. They'd block her, hang up on her. They just didn't want to hear about her issues with Max Gardiner anymore. She saw no end to it, and it sent her in a dark spiral which drove her to a suicide attempt. Kathy's life was also impacted by the crude posters. She was a painter, an awesome artist who had her own little troubles to deal with. Sadly, Kathy took her own life in January 2017. Dee was devastated and felt even more alone. The posters continued appearing, but now the tone seemed to imply that Dee was to blame for Kathy's death. When Gardiner turned up at Dee's daughter's workplace, he was arrested for the breach of intervention order. She was absolutely terrified because now he was not only after her or her friends, he was after her daughter. He'd even threw stones at her elderly mother's window. And since her pleas to Victoria Police didn't seem to work, Dee desperately reached out to a politician. She wrote to an MP. In a letter, she said, "Does my daughter or myself have to turn up dead before we can get any help? What exactly should happen to us before he's sent to jail?" The MP passed the letter on to the Victorian Police Minister, who referred it to the Family Violence Investigation Unit. And that's where Dee would meet the woman she called her saviour, Detective Senior Constable Beck Norris, a 28-year-old who had only been a detective for 2 years. But this detective was like no other detective. This is exactly why she was handpicked by her boss, Detective Senior Sergeant Tanya Gallagher. It is because of her tenacity, her patience, and her victim-centric policing. Dee struck the detective as very tired, extremely exhausted, frustrated with the system and the process. So Detective Norris said, "I had my work cut out for me to try and build a trusting relationship with Dee." After Dee handed over a thick file full of evidence she had herself compiled, the detective quickly established that there were other women who'd fallen victim of Max Gardiner. You see, it wasn't his first time. His first conviction for breach of intervention dated back 3 decades, all the way back to 1989. Yet, none of the previous victims agreed to make a statement. Now I know we could easily say, why wouldn't you? Wouldn't you want to stop him from harming anybody else? However, we don't know the level of fear. We don't know how much their own lives were torn apart, and that could possibly be the reason why they didn't even want to come and talk. Maybe they were afraid that he'd start focusing on them again. Detective Norris reviewed a file full of evidence, and she was able to construct a timeline of offence over the 3-year period. In August 2018, police raided Max Gardiner's house and found a balaclava, gloves, the same tape as were on the posters, and a torn photo from Kathy's Facebook page. However, neither the CCTV and DNA or fingerprints testing could prove beyond a reasonable doubt who the identity of the stalker was. Unfortunately, in this case, the clues left behind by Max weren't ones to be found in a lab. Coincidentally, though, the mistakes made by Max were exactly the same mistakes made by Ted Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, who killed 3 people and injured another 23 in a span of 17 years. And here comes in the story Mr. James R. Fitzgerald. Detective Norris reached out to him. He was the FBI linguistic profiler famed for cracking the Unabomber case, which led to Kaczynski's arrest. And in this case, he used the same strategy used to crack the Unabomber case. He compared the anonymous posters with Gardiner's original love letters to Dee and decoded that it was the same person who wrote both. This technique had never been done in Australia before, as far as Detective Norris knew, so evidently she felt nervous, as she wasn't sure how the court was going to receive and accept that piece of evidence. But no one could deter Mr. Fitzgerald's confidence in his ability to tell either way if Gardiner was the author of the posters. He told the Australian story. There's a lot that can be told by someone's spoken language, or even in their written language, even if they try to disguise it, because eventually the features of their long-term usage of language will manifest themselves in the writings. He looks for different sorts of emboldened sentences, for the spaces between abbreviations, for the spaces between words and punctuations, for the possessives and plurals that Max was getting wrong. What he found most striking and odd was the usage of one-sentence paragraphs, most of which were indented at the same time. His findings gave it the highest possibility that the author of the letters and posters were one and the same, Max Gardiner. So armed with all her evidence, in April 2019, the young detective Norris charged Gardiner with 28 offences, including stalking, recklessly causing serious injury for the PTSD suffered by Dee. In Victoria, stalking carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. Reckless causing serious injury carries 15 years. Gardiner agreed to plead guilty on the conditions that the prosecution would drop the serious injury charges. On February 19, 2020, Gardiner was convicted of stalking. Now hold on to your britches, because you're probably hoping that Max received the highest allowance, considering that he'd been stalking for 30 years. Sadly, Max received 8 months in jail with a 2-year correction order, which is similar to community service. A community correction order is a flexible sentencing order that an offender serves in the community. A court can impose a community correction order on its own or in addition to imprisonment or a fine. In the higher courts, the maximum length of a community correction order is 5 years. In the magistrates' court, the maximum length of a community correction order can be 2 years for one offence, 4 years for 2 offences, 5 years for 3 or more offences. He even tried to appeal the sentence, which was rejected, and he was warned by the court that his sentence could be increased if he persisted. It was a bittersweet moment for Dee to watch Gardiner do the walk of shame, shackled and handcuffed. But he tormented her life for over 5 years, yet he got less than a year of jail time. All the suffering she had to endure during that time, the mental torture, the loss of her best friend in the midst of it all. In Dee's own words, I ask, why does he get away with that? Just because the harm he caused cannot be seen. As Professor Douglas rightfully put it, to really follow it right through the way she has is quite courageous and exceptional. I think it's amazing. A lot of women would have felt like they had to give up. Dee is very proud to have been able to bring Max Gardiner to justice, but she remains nervous to this day and does not know what her future holds. She openly says that she has been preparing for the worst. Given how so many stalking cases end, one would think that a complete reform of the system and a whole set of preventative measures would be put in place. Why are victims either overlooked or the ones having to conduct their own investigations to be taken seriously? Time and time again we hear we need to do better. If not now, when? Stalking is basically homicide in slow motion. In Dee's own words, as Max has made it clear that he wants her dead. All he received was a 12-month good behavior bond and anger management classes. Yet, he's slowly killing me in that I had to change jobs. I don't do what I used to do. My freedom is gone. I'm always looking out for him, even more so now that he's out of jail, as he is angry and argumentative in regards to me. I am waiting for him to come here to hurt me. He has a long 30-year history of stalking and harassment. Yet, it's all about his rights, not his victims. Coercive control needs to be made a criminal offense. The love bombing, which is where they overwhelm you with loving words, charm, and use this as a manipulation. Gaslighting, which is to cause a victim to question their reality and become paranoid. Smear or shaming campaign. Projection, intimidation, tracking devices, phones or vehicle monitoring via phones and computers. Threats and other abuse such as financial control, insult, isolating, sexual coercion, and the use of children and pets against the victim. All of these are used to cause harm, as in suicide, to punish, to frighten, which leads to long-lasting psychological trauma. For the offender, it's all about power over the victim.
Alright, before we check out, I'd just like to remind you to join us next week on our roundtable discussion for this case.